Assalamualaikum and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IMU CTNH Semiorecphone Webinar Series 2021. My name is Jamila and I will be your Master of Ceremony for today's event. But before we begin, I would like to share some housekeeping rules. We have muted the microphones for all attendees, and for your information, this live talk session is being recorded. And if you do have any questions or any feedback, please feel free to use the Q&A panel and leave those questions and feedback there. This webinar is a collaborative effort between the International Medical University Center for Transformative Nutrition and Health, or CTNH, and also the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization Regional Center of Food and Nutrition, or Semiorecphone, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. And the goal of this collaboration is to initiate, to foster, and to sustain multidisciplinary collaborations to advance research. And the theme for today's webinar is Dietary Patterns in Disease Prevention, Multi-Country Experience. And with this initiative, we hope that a wider impact in public health can take place through this scientific forum. And for your information, we have received more than 1,200 people who have actually registered for this event, and that is a very encouraging number. We hope you will enjoy the program today. So without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. Yang Wayu, the head of the Department for the Division of Nutrition and Dietetics, IMU, to give the welcoming address and the opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Yang.
Jamila, I have some technical issue. I cannot start my video. Okay.
You're on it.
Okay, thank you. Right. Thank you, Jamila, for the introduction. So on behalf of International Medical University Malaysia, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all present here today at this webinar. As what Jamila has mentioned, this is a collaborative effort between IMU with Semiorecphone Indonesia. I'm happy to inform that the first part of this webinar series that was held back in July was organized under Semiorecphone, was very well received by the attendees. And with that, I'm very confident that today, with this second part of the webinar, it will be the same, because we have the presentations by speakers whom are known experts and also have been personally handpicked by the organizing committee. And not forgetting, we have two postgraduate students from Malaysia and Indonesia who will be sharing their research. Congratulations once again to the organizing team. I wish everyone a fruitful learning session for the next hour or so, and have some take-home messages in relation to dietary patterns in disease prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang, for the opening remarks. Today, we are very honored and we are very fortunate to have three eminent speakers across different regions of the world to share their country's dietary pattern and disease prevention. Thank you so much to Laureate Professor Claire Collins from the University of Newcastle, Australia, Dr. Umi Fahmida from Semiorecphone and the NLP alumni, as well as to Professor Janet Kidd from University of Leeds, United Kingdom. As Dr. Yang has mentioned just now, this webinar also features two postgraduate students joining us as part of the capacity building to share results from their research, Dr. Nigno Izzati and also Dr. Vitri Ardini. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's not waste any more time. The session will be moderated by my colleague, and she's none other than Professor Nurima Abdul Karim. And here is some background about Prof. Nurima. She has more than 35 years of experience working as a lecturer at a public university, and she has published more than 100 publications. She was the chairman for the technical group Nutrition Research at the Ministry of Health Malaysia, and she wrote chapters in our Malaysian dietary guidelines, as well as our RNI, or recommended nutrient intake. And currently, she's the Vice President of the Malaysian Association for the Study of Obesity, or MASO, and she has also served as the Honorary Secretary for Nutrition Society of Malaysia, or NSM. So Prof. Nerima, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Jamila. I think if you unshare the screen, then we will be able to see everybody, right? Okay, but anyway, okay, thank you, Jamila. Right, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our speakers and the two postgraduate students who will be sharing your presentation this afternoon in Malaysia. So before we start the session, let me provide you with some guidelines rather, instead of rules, just to remind that each main speaker will have 20 minutes for your presentation, and 3 minutes before the end of your presentation, I will switch on my video and also my microphone, and I will let you know that, ladies, you have 3 minutes left to wrap up your presentation. So after that, the Q&A for all the sessions will be held at the end of the webinar, after the three speakers and also after the 3-minute presentation of the postgraduate students. Okay, so I suppose that's all right. So without wasting any time, I would like to invite our first speaker, Laureate Professor Claire Collins from University of Newcastle, Australia. So let me tell you more about Prof. Collins. She is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, Nutrition Society of Australia, and Dietitians Australia. Prof. Collins' research focuses on personalized nutrition technologies and programs evaluating impact on diet-related health across life stages and chronic diseases. She has published more than 400 publications, and also now a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, fellow of Nutrition Society, also fellow of Dietitians Australia. So she is a very sought after nutrition science media commentator and the most read Australian author on the conversation, with more than 12 million readers globally. She also co-created EDX, massive open online course, The Science of Weight Loss, Dispelling Diet Myths, and this was completed by more than 73 people across 180 countries. So let me invite Prof. Collins to share with us, with the title of a presentation, what does the research tell us about dietary patterns for child weight management? Over to you, Prof. Collins.
Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And it gives me great pleasure to talk to you this evening, it is in Australia. So I'm going to share with you, what does the research tell us about dietary patterns for child weight management? And I'm going to just cover these 4 main points. So let's have a look at the background first up. So globally, overweight and obesity prevalence in 5 to 19-year-olds has increased more than 4 times. So from 4% to 18%, almost 1 in 5 children globally. Worldwide, that's 340 million children. It's almost hard to comprehend, isn't it, that huge number? And about 50% of children under 5 who had overweight or obesity in 2019 live across Asia. And at the same time, there's a double burden of disease, with stunting prevalent as well as wasting, with the same issue related to overweight and obesity. I had a look at some data that I could find from from Malaysia. And what they found was that nearly 30% of 5 to 17-year-olds have overweight, and almost half of those, in fact, have obesity. And again, about 22% of children under age 5 are stunted at the same time. And the increase in stunting is also occurring concurrently. So what do we know about dietary patterns for children's health needs? Well, dietary patterns are really important for influencing not only growth and health, but also well-being, that sense of achieving your potential. Modifying dietary intake is key to managing childhood overweight and obesity. But until recently, most systematic reviews that had looked at child obesity treatment had really only focused on weight outcomes and not on dietary outcomes at all. So then you have to think about, well, how could you look at diet in the context of interventions? And this is where the concept diet quality comes into play. Poor diet quality, which means not meeting your food group needs, vegetables and fruit, whole grains, dairy, and that could be country specific, and not meeting your micronutrient intakes. So that actually accounts for the largest proportion of burden of disease globally. And here in Australia, poor dietary patterns are actually our third highest contributor to our global burden of disease. Number one is smoking, but of all the other top 6 risk factors, they're all influenced by diet, things like high blood glucose and high blood fat levels. At the same time, systematic reviews of diet quality show that if you eat more like your country's dietary guidelines, the rates of chronic disease and death from any cause are lower. It really is surprising that nutrition is not a higher priority within all of our countries in the world. So let's jump in and look a little bit more closer now at how you measure diet quality. So the advantage of something like a diet quality index or a diet quality score means you can use one single numeric figure to say how closely somebody might eat like their country's nutrition recommendations. And it provides a comprehensive picture of everything a person eats. So diet quality scores, no matter which one you use, and there are more than 50 of these scores in use around the world, they compare to each country-specific recommendations. Sometimes they're based on food intake only and variety within food groups, like the vegetables and fruit or whole grains, but sometimes they also include a nutrient target, whether that be sodium or saturated fat or dietary fibre. And longitudinal studies then use these scores and put them into quantiles from high diet quality through to low diet quality. So we recently updated an old review that we had done to see what we know about diet quality using these indices and children. And we found that there are 37 that have been evaluated for reliability or validity, and 11 of 15 that looked at the relationship between diet quality and health outcomes found what I just had described, that having a better diet quality, eating more like your country's dietary guidelines, means that you have better health. And the indices that have been measured include quality of life, blood pressure, body composition, so higher muscle mass, lower fat mass, metabolic syndrome, and some studies have even shown a relationship with IQ, so intelligence quotient. But there are relatively few of these that have actually looked at health outcomes. And I looked up the Malaysian food pyramid and the 14 recommendations made in your dietary guidelines. And then when I looked back into our review, there actually are 2 of these diet quality indexes that have been developed for children and adolescents in Malaysia. And if you go to that review paper, here are the references, those 3 there. And these 2 are on the same diet quality index. So I would encourage you to use those or include those tools in your studies. So let's now have a look at childhood obesity interventions and what do we know about diet in that context. Well, dietary interventions are used to improve the relative weight status of interventions for treating children with overweight or obesity or preventing it. That makes sense, doesn't it? But if you're going to do an intervention, you really do need to know which part of the intervention works, which messages of the comprehensive advice given to families was the key bit that families were able to use to improve their child's dietary patterns and relative weight status. If we know that, it means we can refine our advice and not give advice that nobody uses or is not effective. So the big message we know is that if there's an intervention that includes a target or a focus on food and nutrition, it works. That's the first key message. And we did our first systematic review on interventions that include a dietary component. It was published way back in 2006. And this was actually the first time anyone had tried to meta-analyze studies in childhood obesity that use diet. So I'm going to explain to you this figure. It's called a forest plot. What all these studies are here are all the individual studies contributing to the meta-analysis in the systematic review. The boxes are the mean effect from each individual study, and this indicates the confidence interval. And the bigger the box, the bigger the weighting of the study in the overall meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is just a mathematical way of adding up all the studies as though they were one. And what you can see down here, the diamond, this is that adding up of all of the studies. This line that here says 0, if the diamond crosses 0, it would mean there is no difference between a treatment and a control. On this side, on the left-hand side, you'll see if the diamond's on this side, it favours the treatment or the intervention. And if it's on this side, it favours the control. So what we saw back in 2006 was that if an intervention included a dietary component, there was a greater impact on weight status at the end of the intervention compared to having any type of control. We then came back in 2012 and reran the search. That earlier search had actually been done in 2003. It was the first ever systematic review we did, and it took us 3 years because a lot of things were still done by hand back then. So then in 2012, we came back and updated that review. And this is what we found. There's the reference there for you. This time, we were able to conduct many meta-analyses. And I hope the header is not cutting off the meta-analysis on your screen. It's a little bit distorted on my screen. But this first meta-analysis is comparing lifestyle interventions compared to usual care, because sometimes children are receiving care from whether it's a local hospital or a local doctor. And this time, the main thing again that jumps out is that the interventions that have a dietary component favour the lifestyle interventions. And in this first meta-analysis, this was looking at interventions that were shorter, like less than 6 months, or interventions that went for a whole year. And you can see that it didn't matter how long the intervention went for, that when they were all added up, they work. And in this bottom slide, this time it's at follow-up. So this is the change in BMI now at follow-up. And it's the same message, whether the interventions targeted children only or children and adolescents, they work. This next meta-analysis is looking at change in BMI at the end of active treatment in that first one, when the comparison group is now written materials. So we gave the family a handout, and you can see that it is crossing that line of 0 in the top figure. So basically, the intervention wasn't actually any better than written materials in this one here. When it was made relative to the population, underlying population, using a score called a BMI Z-score, which is just comparing that child's BMI to age and sex matched children from the same population, it was effective. So I think the message here is at least give written information, even if you don't have anything available. But an intervention is actually better for BMI, the effect on BMI Z-score compared to other children in the population. And in this slide, we're now looked at some of the metabolic outcomes, and mostly that diamond is on the left, favoring the intervention group. So for triglycerides, for LDL cholesterol, but no effect for HDL cholesterol, which is possibly what you might expect because these interventions didn't necessarily have a physical activity component, which is the part of an intervention you would expect a bigger effect on HDL cholesterol. So far to 2012, we've updated this systematic review twice. And the summary message that we saw about the types of diets being used is that most RCTs, most trials, were using some sort of hierarchy to categorize the foods into green foods to eat more of, foods to be cautious about the amount, and foods to avoid. And you can probably guess what those foods to avoid were. It's mostly junk foods, or typically described in research as energy dense and nutrient poor. Some of the interventions were using types of food or calorie exchange programs, but these were really starting to phase out. And we saw that there were very limited studies putting two types of dietary interventions against one another to see if dietary interventions could be refined. So we've been updating that review for the third time, and it was published just earlier this year in the Journal of Human Nutrition and Dietetics. And it's registered in Prospero if you want to see how we describe the trial, and we completed a methodology checklist. I'm just checking in because I actually can't see anyone to check on my time. And what we found now, 117 randomized controlled trials. 8 studies met all the methodological criteria. So there's still not that many really high quality studies. I'm going to have to speed up because I'm thinking I might be running out of time shortly.
You have 5 minutes.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you. I minimized the screen. And you can read about all of these components in the paper, but I'll just give you some headline stats. Look at this. 80 studies have now been conducted since 2011. Most studies include boys and girls. So I think there is room for more studies, particularly in boys alone, tailoring it to their needs. And there are now lots of studies done in adolescents, whereas when we started looking at this way back in 2006, there were relatively few in adolescents. So I think we now have lots of studies. What we need now is studies that look at the clinical setting, that are done in the real world. And mostly retention rates are actually pretty good. When you look around the world, the studies are highly biased towards North America, not that many really done in Asia Pacific or in Europe, and very limited studies in the Middle East or Central America. I'm going to skip over that slide there. And something else I wanted to point out to you is when we look at these studies now, the majority of them are now involving a dietitian. The first review, it was extremely rare to have dietitians involved in those studies. So this is really positive. And it's becoming more common now to report adherence to the dietary intervention, but it's still only about 53% of studies. So what we found was when we looked at, okay, are studies now reporting dietary outcomes? Way back in 2006, we found that only 17 studies had ever talked about whether families were able to change their children's dietary patterns. And now there are many, many studies. 81 RCTs have reported total energy intake, 38 fruit and vegetables, and so on. And I'll give you a little bit more information on these. And these are the sort of changes that are occurring. Statistically significant reductions have been reported in total energy intake in up to 6 months and for longer than 6 months. 7 studies have reported increased short-term at 2 months serves of vegetables and fruit, and up to 12 months smaller, but still increases in vegetable and fruit. 7 studies have reported reductions in sugar-sweetened beverages, or soft drink, we call it in our country, and right up to 2 years. 5 studies have reported a reduction in those energy-dense, nutrient-poor red foods, 3 in the savoury red foods, so things like packets of potato crisps, and 4 in sugary types of snacks. And there are a number of studies that are still looking at macronutrients. We were able to do a meta-analysis on energy intake change. And just have a look, we've presented this one slightly different so that we can quantify and compare over time. But this is baseline energy intake across the included studies. This is the big reduction at 6 months. It comes back a bit of regression towards the mean around 7 to 12 months, and not statistically significant at 12 months.
Claire, 2
Yes?
minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay. So the take-home messages, this is the infographic that we had in our trial. And I'll just summarize that for you by what I would say is involve a dietitian in your dietary intervention, use specific dietary advice and evidence-based resources that targets food group changes that is summarized in our review. Target fruit and vegetable consumption as 2 separate ways of positive changes, and use food-based guidelines rather than nutrient guidelines. And we believe that technology now, particularly because of COVID, can be a really helpful way to reach a wider audience. And please evaluate the dietary interventions using valid messages, and particularly in the clinical setting. I'd like to acknowledge all of the collaborators on this most recent update of the review and our funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Claire, for the sharing. I suppose even though we don't see a lot of studies in Southeast Asia on all this intervention, but there are now in the last 10 years, more studies are taking up this thing. So I'm sure your presentation will be very useful for all our participants here. So we move on to our second speaker, Dr. Umi Famida, an old friend of mine. We attended the Southeast Asian Nutrition Leadership Program, my God, how many years ago? Maybe about 20 years ago. So Dr. Umi will be talking about what to eat for disease prevention, a linear programming approach for food-based recommendation. But before that, let me introduce you more about her. So Dr. Umi is a senior researcher and program coordinator of early childhood care, nutrition and education at Simeo University, Indonesia. She has a PhD from the University of Indonesia, and research interests are on nutrient and non-nutrient interaction related to child growth and development, and the use of linear programming to evaluate food-based recommendation. So now, under model of partnership to translate guidelines into practices for optimal diet of Southeast Asia community. So she and her team promoted linear programming approach in Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and also the Philippines for both the community and also community school settings. So she is now currently involved in UKRI GCRF Action Against Stunting Hub as country lead for Indonesia. With that introduction, Dr. Umi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Nurima, and glad to meet again our CNLP colleagues back. It was 2002, the first batch of CNLP, and greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for you all. Allow me to share my screen. Okay, so it is a pleasure for me to share about the topic here, which is related to disease prevention. In particular, I would like to share about what to eat for disease prevention based on diet modeling using a linear programming approach to develop food-based recommendations. Just to brief us, sometimes we come across the term FDDG, which stands for Food-Based Dietary Guidelines. And in more recent publications related to the use of linear programming for diet modeling, we more often use the term food-based recommendations. Actually, we more recently use often the term food-based recommendations because usually FDDG is more a country, a national guidelines, where the FBR can be more translated into subpopulation specific, and usually this is what the diet modeling like LP is assisting. And here I would like to share briefly first about the approach, the linear programming or LP, and then
Dr. Umi, would you like to share your screen?
oh yeah, moment. Oh, sorry. It is. Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Nurima. Sorry, apologize for that. So now can you see here clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so just to brief us on the term FDDG and the FBR. So basically what we often use the term FBR is to help translate the national level FDDG, food-based dietary guideline, into something which is more food-based, more population specific. And here I would like to brief about the method briefly, and then one application for use in disease prevention, particularly for developing FBR for women of reproductive age with dyslipidemia. Our previous work is mostly a lot in the diet optimization, but we have start to have some studies for disease prevention. The linear programming, I think, is basically an approach for optimization, which is used in many disciplines. And here, basically, it is a goal programming, where in dietary diet modeling, we aim for fulfilling the RNI of energy and nutrients. At the same time, remain within the constraint of the food available, the food pattern, and also the portion. And sometimes we can also consider the cost of the diet. And using this, actually, it can be helpful to identify a combination and suggestion of what specific like food subgroup or food items to consume. And briefly, this LP approach basically make use of the dietary data, where we have the list of food items with the portion and the pattern, which is a frequency of consumption per week, and the food cost optionally, where we will make use of the modeling to generate the best combination of foods to achieve the best achievement of RNI for nutrients. And at the same time, we will also test its robustness when we minimize how it will remain to be within still the same level. Usually, for most nutrients, we define the safe level as the EAR, the estimated average requirement. And here also is the potential of this approach to identify more specifically the nutrient-dense food or food subgroups that we can highlight more specifically in our FBR. And the data that we need for this approach, of course, derived from the dietary data. It can be a survey of single 24-hour recalls, for example, or more ideally within the study setting, we can have a data of 1 full week for each individual. We usually use a combination of a 24-hour recall of yesterday, a weighing of today, and the next 5 days of belly. And for this, we will also need the nutrient composition, of course, of the foods which are consumed. And of course, we need a goal. And the goal will be energy and nutrient requirement. And in the diet for disease prevention, we may also need to specify the target. For example, how much do we translate the PUFA into the goal for the diet modeling. Of course, we also need to define the body weight. And in the case of, for example, overweight subject, it may be useful to also consider not only actual body weight, but also prescriptive body weight. And from this dietary data, basically, we will have 3 levels of information at the food item level, and then group into subgroup and also food groups. And we will have the information for the food item, of course, the portion is a gram per meal. And for each of these 3 levels, we also will have the minimum and maximum frequency of consumption per week, plus at the food group, the median frequency of consumption per week. And so briefly in the diet modeling where we use the OptiFood, we will have the input at the food items level. And we also need to define whether it is a staple or a snack, the food based on the local food pattern. And then we will group them into the food group based on the OptiFood food groupings and also the food subgroups. And you can see here the overview of the function in the OptiFood, where we have the requirement based on the FAO RNI as a default, but you also can put your country-specific RNI as the goal. And here are the default nutrients which are available in the OptiFood. And more recently, with our students and our team working in the diet prevention, of course, we want to expand more. So now we also start to include the PUFA, MUFA, and also dietary fiber into the diet model. So briefly, the first function, input of in the OptiFood will look like this. So you will define the target group, you will define the RNI that you that is specific to the target group, and for the adults, of course, also the body weight and also the physical activity level that we assume. And of course, also for iron and zinc, we need to assume a specific bioavailability relevant to the pattern of the diet. For example, for most of Indonesian studies, we usually assume iron bioavailability of 10% and zinc of moderate, given that we still consume quite some animal source food, but not in big proportion. And then when all these inputs are, so to say, run to find the best combination, it will present the first output, like you can see here, which will show us the 2 best combination of all the frequency of the foods. And basically, the main purpose of this is to show if some nutrients will be below the requirement of 100% RNI. And we here will call these nutrients as problem nutrients. So you see here 2 bars, blue and orange. The blue is actually referring to the food pattern where the median frequency of food group is close to the actual one, while the no food pattern will be the one where we can go toward a more frequent consumption of nutritious food, but still within the limit of the LP input, where we define minimum as the 5th percentile and the maximum at the 95th percentile. So for example, here, using the default nutrients, you can see here like calcium, iron, and zinc are the problem nutrients identified in this analysis. And then in the module 3, we will test the robustness of how the combination of the food can fulfill the nutrient requirement. Firstly, we will check for the problem nutrients by maximizing. And for example, here, if calcium, iron, and zinc are already identified as the problem nutrients, if when we maximize it and we still cannot achieve 100% RNI, we call them as absolute problem nutrients. Some nutrients, some problem nutrients can reach 100% when we maximize it. We call it as partial problem nutrients. And in this LP, it means like if we have the partial problem nutrients, actually the case is easier because actually the solutions are in the food basket, but we just need to promote more consumption more frequently. But if it is an absolute problem nutrient, we may need to consider expansion of the food basket, which is not necessarily food from the outside, but maybe food from the food basket of different family members, for example, in the area. And the second function of this module 3 also to check whether the other nutrients, which are not problem nutrients, will be safe, so to say. When we minimize it, it will stay at the ER or higher than ER, more or less around 65 to 70% RNI, assuming the SD of 15% of many nutrients. And for example, here you can see the blue bar, the minimized one, for example, like thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, B6, and folate. Even they are not problem nutrients, but it is possible, if not highlighted in the dietary message, it can go below the safety level. So basically, using the LP approach, we can identify each nutrient into either problem nutrient absolute or partial. And if they are not problem nutrients, whether they are still below the safety level, we call it dietary inadequate, or everything is fine, meaning actually the food pattern already take care of that nutrient. So finally, using this function, we can also identify more specifically if, for example, zinc, for example, is a problem nutrient, what are the food items or food subgroups that can be highlighted in the message, dietary message, to be consumed more frequently. So now I would like to share about the example of how we can make use of this LP approach to develop food-based recommendation for women of reproductive age with dyslipidemia, a study done by my colleagues, Dr. Gusnedi, and it is done in Minangkabau, West Sumatra. We use this LP approach using the OptiFood, and we identified that the problem nutrients are actually among these women are mostly PUFA, both the M3 and M6 fatty acids, also dietary fiber, but at the same time they are also lacking iron and zinc intake, which are important for, of course, the nutrient of the pregnancy. And then we also identify the nutrient-dense food to meet these problem nutrients which are available and consumed. These include the fish, egg, and poultry, soybean product, mostly tempeh and tofu. We also identify they consume the small potato, and the skin is good to also add the fiber, and of course the dark green leafy vegetables. And with these problem nutrients of PUFA, fiber, iron, and zinc, basically we try to compare different combinations, and this can be done also quite quick in the OptiFood software. And for example, here we find that this combination will be providing the highest RNI for PUFA, fiber, iron, and zinc. And this is what we put into the final recommendation. So more or less the message for FBR will look like this. So basically it will start with the main guideline in line with the food-based dietary guideline. But based on the finding of problem nutrients and the nutrient-dense food, for example, we will specify more about what to consume in how often. For example, here to meet the PUFA, we highlight on the intake of egg, seafish, and poultry. But also for the fiber, we recommend the consumption of soybean product like tofu or tempeh, dark green leafy vegetables, and also fruit. At this, also potato skin. And at the same time, we also discourage or encourage to reduce the fried foods and foods cooked with coconut milk. And this is the message also along with the recommended portion. And from this FBR, we have done the RCT to assess how this the promotion of the FBR may improve the dietary intake, the food pattern and dietary intake of the subject, and eventually also the lipid profile. This part is on effect on the intake level, and we did intervention, a 12-week intervention where we have the FBR group having a monthly group meetings and also weekly home visits by the trained educators. And these are the women of reproductive age, age 20 to 44 years, with the abnormal blood lipid profile, in non-pregnant state. So as you can see here, this slide shows the how the group, the FBR group, in comparison with the control group in terms of the food pattern. You see here that from the green bar of the minimum frequency that we recommend, we have more significantly higher, more frequent consumption per week of fish, poultry, tempeh tofu, potato with skin, DGL fish, and fruits. These are the positive expected outcomes that we have from the intervention. However, indeed, for the reduction of the fried foods and the use of coconut milk, here you can see we don't have the significant difference yet. This is related to also the practice, the recipes, as you can see on the right side. Many of the local recipes still use the coconut milk. Maybe some are similar with Malaysia. And actually, another PhD students involved in this study also look into the dietary inflammatory index, comparing the women with dyslipidemia and the control women. And besides a significantly different score on also PUFA and fat, also energy, we found that consumption of garlic, shallot, and curcumins are significantly higher among the women with non-dyslipidemia. So dietary inflammatory index is actually some kind of index where, based on the previous study, it combined the scoring of energy, nutrients, and also food components, like also food items like this, garlic. And then we score into a score of DII, where the higher intake is more inflammatory, and the higher score is more inflammatory, and the lower score is less inflammatory.
Dr. Umi, 3 minutes.
Okay, Rima, thank you. So these are the second last slide I would like to show, and basically with these changes in dietary pattern, you can see here that the control group, the FBR group will have actually a lower intake of fat, also higher intake of PUFA, and also a better polyunsaturated to saturated fatty acid. And as you can see here, the difference is significant for the changes in energy, carbohydrate, fatty acid, and ratio. And especially in particular, the intervention group finally can meet the range ratio of P to S ratio of at least 0.6. So in summary, we show here that a diet modeling using linear programming can be used to develop a food-based recommendation for disease prevention. I give example of how it is for dyslipidemia case, where we found using this approach specifically problem nutrients, and also the food groups, food subgroup and items to be promoted and highlighted in the food-based recommendations. As you can also see from the results that some practices are more easier to improve, like the women can increase more significantly on the fish, on the DGL fish, but some others are more difficult to change. For example, reduction on fried foods and foods cooked with the coconut milk. And from the other study looking at the dietary inflammatory index, actually it is also adding potential to strengthen the FBR, to also promote the local practices by highlighting and encouraging the use of spices protective to this lipidemia, as well as highlighting the specific cooking methods like more bakar, roasted, and then non use of coconut milk and more spices. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope this adds to our discussion next. Thank you, Nurima. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Umi. It's nice to hear that now we can use modeling with using linear programming, even for problems, health problems that we have. What I can tell is food consumption pattern of Indonesian and Malaysian. We are very much serupun or quite similar. So I think we should be working with you in Indonesia to learn about this linear programming. I know it's been a while, but I know only very few Malaysians are into this linear programming, at least for me. So thank you, Dr. Umi. So we have come to our third speaker. She is Prof. Janet Kate from University of Leeds, and I have known Prof. Janet from my PhD days. God, that was how many years? My son is 25 years old now. When I had my viva, my son was only a 6-month-old infant. Okay, so today we're going to listen to Prof. Janet Kate to talk about, can diet prevent cancer? Unlocking the evidence. But before that, let me introduce you to Prof. Janet Kate. She leads the Nutritional Epidemiology Group at the University of Leeds, and she obtained her PhD from MRC Environmental Epidemiology Unit in Southampton. That was where I did my PhD, but from University of Southampton Nutrition Department. And she was under the guidance of the late Professor David Barker. Yeah, so her main areas of research are nutritional epidemiology and the relationship of diet to chronic disease development. She has run the UK Women's Cohort Study for over 20 years and her focus on development of new dietary assessment methods. That's what I did for my PhD. And, and she is the director now of a University Leeds spin-out Dietary Assessment Limited, supporting a validated online dietary assessment tool, MyFood24. She also served on the UK Committee on Toxicity of Chemicals in Food consumer products, and also another one tool on dietary assessment, which is NutriTools. Yeah, you are just like me. I was the honorary secretary of Nutrition Society of Malaysia, and Janet is the honorary secretary for the Association for Nutrition. So with that, please, Prof. Janet Kate, your paper, Can Diet Prevent Cancer? Unlocking the Evidence.
Great, thank you everyone. Now, I'm hoping you can see my slideshow, can you?
Yes, yes, your slide is on. Yeah, yeah.
Great. It's really weird, isn't it? You can't quite see what you can see. I can see something, but I don't know if that's what you can see. So, well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you all this morning. And I'm going to get straight on with it because I've been given a challenging title to cover in 20 minutes. So can diet prevent cancer from a dietary patterns perspective? I'm going to be covering some background to this, defining some dietary patterns and cancer links. I will talk about the UK women's cohort study and then just touch briefly on dietary assessment and maybe what we would do differently or what you can do as well. So some statistics, I'm sure you're familiar with this type of information, but we do know that 4 in 10 cancer cases are preventable, and much of that prevention could be through improved dietary behavior. The cancer process, as we know, is complex of interactions between diet, lifestyle factors, environment and host factors. So diet clearly isn't the only, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong thing, the only thing to have an influence here, but it is an important influence for us. So what are dietary patterns? Here's a bit of a stereotype, I suppose, but gives you the idea. And there are different ways that have been used within cohort studies, particularly to assess dietary patterns. There are those which are hypothesis orientated and use predefined indices and scores, healthy eating index, that type of thing, Mediterranean diet, or exploratory approach using the data within the study itself to generate a pattern, either cluster analysis or principal component analysis, that type of approach. I'm using this paper just to give you a quick review. It's a nice paper summarizing the evidence published last year in Nature Reviews, summarizing the evidence around dietary patterns and cancer risk. So this slide shows the a priori healthy eating index type of approach, and they summarize that the evidence is strongest for colorectal cancer, with the healthy eating index, the Mediterranean diet score, and the DASH dietary approaches to stop hypertension dietary pattern, as well as semi-vegetarian diets, reducing risk of colorectal cancer. And if you go into the paper, you'll see this figure and you can look at the other information there too. This slide summarizes those exploratory approaches to generating dietary patterns, and the paper summarizes that a Western dietary pattern consistently increases risk of cancers, particularly colorectal cancer, but a prudent or healthy dietary pattern can reduce risk of breast, colorectal and lung cancer. An alcohol drinker pattern is increasing risk of breast, colorectal, pancreatic and esophageal cancer. And I think we don't often sort of consider that alcohol consumption pattern. The evidence is relatively strong for alcohol. So where can we find the evidence to back up these statements? I'm going to focus a little here on the World Cancer Research Fund International Continuous Update Project. If you are interested in any dietary component or dietary pattern and in relation to any cancer outcome, this is the place to come and look, because they do all the hard work for you, summarizing the evidence. And they grade their evidence into strong or limited. And overall, for dietary patterns, of course, there's lots of individual nutrients, but for dietary patterns, the consumption of diets with whole grains protects against colorectal cancer, and foods with fiber also protects against colorectal cancer, as well as weight gain, overweight and obesity, which we know is linked to some cancer risk. There's limited evidence, and it is amazing to me, having worked in this field for so many years, as Nerima kindly pointed out, that we still have limited evidence for many of these dietary components in relation to cancer risk. What we can say is that non-starchy vegetables and fruit seems to reduce risk of cancers and also protects against weight gain and obesity. A greater glycemic load also increases risk of endometrial cancer, and alcohol, again here, increases risk of cancer. So the World Cancer Research Fund sort of overall summary is that there's the greatest risk of cancer for people who consume no or low intakes of non-starchy vegetables or fruit. But interestingly, the evidence is less clear for increasing benefit with greater consumption. So those who aren't eating much of it are at increased risk, but just eating lots more of it may not provide greater reduced risk. Dietary patterns linked to a lower risk of cancer consistently feature high consumption of whole grains, fiber, and non-starchy fruit and veg. And we know that the evidence base which is out there has limitations, leading to inconsistent findings. Earlier case control studies, we see far less of these being published now, but back in the day they were very popular because they're easier to conduct. But there is clearly an opportunity for response bias, particularly from the cases who know they have a condition. So these are really out of favor now. And cohort studies do give mixed results. And you can see here's an example of fruit fiber in relation to colon cancer, a dose response. And, you know, the Giovannucci paper, these are all relatively old papers, but potentially sort of increasing risk, plateauing out, a Willett paper, reducing risk. You know, what do you make of that? Definitions of foods, when we were involved in some of the systematic reviews that the World Cancer Research Fund had done, it was clear that food definitions really vary from study to study, from country to country, as indeed nutrient definitions vary. Residual confounding, a really important topic, and I've got a slide at the end which just suggests using sort of causal association approaches to try and identify what are those confounding factors that we should include in our models. And the approaches to measurement up until now, really in these big studies, have been limited food frequency questionnaires of all different nature. So casting doubt, I would say, on the quality and strength of our existing evidence base. However, the best evidence that we do have around dietary patterns in relation to cancer risk comes from cohort studies. And I want to illustrate from my own experience with the UK women's cohort study, some results in relation to dietary patterns. So this map here just shows England, Wales, and Scotland, and each red dot is an individual participant in our study. And we've collected data, we've gone through very laborious ethical committee approvals, and more recently record linkage with NHS digital data, lots of regulatory processes to go through now, which were not present 20 years ago. And I just note here that we at the University of Leeds do not own our outcome data. That's been provided by NHS Digital, so we have to treat it in the way that they want us to treat it. It's challenging to meet all these requirements, but you need to be aware, I guess. Okay, so who have we got in our cohort? We approached 61,000 women and 35,000 responded, and we have over the last 20 odd years contacted all of the women twice and then undertaken a number of sub-studies. We've published more detailed information, a cohort profile, in the International Journal of Epidemiology, if you'd like to see more. I just thought it's a bit of a busy slide, and it's just amusing, I think. So in the 1990s, when we started the cohort, what was going on? So in the UK, John Major was in charge. Aldi, actually one of the cheap supermarkets, opened its doors for the first time. These are some of the foods that you could buy. They look pretty horrible now, but anyway, that was what our women were eating. This picture is me 20 years ago, so you can see all the grey hair now. And who were the women? They were middle-aged, middle class, mean age 52 when we recruited them. And many of them were nurses or teachers, and according to our data manager at the time, were called Dorothy or Margaret. Of course, they weren't all called Dorothy and Margaret. This slide, now moving on to risk factors for breast cancer, is a summary from the World Cancer Research Fund report. And you can see that there is very few things actually in the strong evidence. Attained adult height increasing risk, alcohol consumption also increasing risk, but limited suggestive for many other nutritional characteristics, non-starchy vegetables, dairy foods, etc. So still limited evidence, even in their most recent review. When we looked at some dietary patterns in our own cohort study, using two different approaches, the common dietary patterns, we predefined these, split the women into vegetarian eating patterns and fish eating dietary patterns. We had a predominant recruitment of women who were vegetarian, so a third of them roughly at the start said they ate a dietary pattern which was characterized as vegetarian. And for postmenopausal women, compared to those eating red meat, we found actually a strong inverse association, a protective effect with the fish eating dietary pattern. And although there was an inverse association, it was not statistically significant for the vegetarian dietary pattern. We also did some cluster analysis, which groups people into similar dietary patterns. And we found that as sort of in this group, if you like, with higher meat consumption, those that we've defined as conservative omnivores in the premenopausal cancer group had an increased risk of breast cancer. And those who were classed as higher diversity vegetarians in the postmenopausal group had a lower risk. So there is some differentiation going on here with regard to dietary pattern and risk of breast cancer. And when we've looked at a bit more detail here in relation to fiber intake in the premenopausal group, for total fiber, there was a statistically significant trend of reduction in risk of breast cancer premenopausally, actually, as total fiber increased. And similar for cereal fiber, but not statistically significant for fruit or vegetable fiber. And postmenopausally, we didn't see any statistically significant trends. And I've just listed a few reasons that I won't have time to go into as to why fiber might be linked to breast cancer risk. The World Cancer Research Fund Continuous Update Project for postmenopausal women in relation to breast cancer and fiber took into account our own cohort, but found that the evidence here was limited, so couldn't make a conclusion. If we look at meat intake in our cohort study, we did find that for both pre and postmenopausal women, there did seem to be an increased risk of breast cancer as meat consumption increased. And that was particularly strong for in postmenopausal women for processed meat. Sorry, that's what I wanted to highlight there. The processed meat was the one that seemed to be driving it. If we move to colorectal cancer, just briefly, again, there's a little bit more evidence here, stronger evidence around red meat increasing risk, and convincing evidence that processed meat and alcoholic drinks also increased risk. Limited evidence on all the remainder, really. We've looked at the Mediterranean diet and risk of colorectal cancer in the UK women's cohort study. And we do see for colorectal cancer, a 12% reduction in risk per 2-unit increase in Mediterranean diet overall. And the strongest association actually was for cancer of the rectum. And when we looked at red meat free versus diets that contained red meat, we saw that actually the effect seemed to be strongest in the distal colon. And this is where feces are stored and gut flora are very dense in that region. So there could be a link there. If we look at whole grains in relation to colorectal cancer risk, again from the Continuous Update Project, it seems likely that whole grain intake reduces risk of colorectal cancer. But if we look at randomized control trials, the evidence is much less clear, no association. These are using polyps as a surrogate endpoint for colorectal cancer and suggest that longer term trials are needed. May not be ever.
Janet, 3
Yes.
minutes.
Okay.
Sorry.
I think I can do it. Thanks. Just to sort of wind up with this exposure angle, that obesity obviously itself is reflective of dietary patterns and has been associated with cancer links. So we know that specific dietary patterns are important here, and each of these circles sort of indicates the more cancer cases in the UK. And I want to highlight some work that a couple of your colleagues and my colleagues have undertaken using the UK women's cohort study in relation to overweight and obesity. Fu-Ming Moy has published here showing that as skirt size and blouse sizes increase, so risk of breast cancer increases. And Sangeeta Shyam, who's on the call today, has also published using the UK women's cohort study showing that hip circumference and skirt size can predict pancreatic cancer risk. So she's the first to look at pancreatic cancer in this cohort. And I welcome others of you to join us and undertake some analysis for yourselves if you're interested. So what are the problems with our overall evidence base? We do have low numbers of cohort studies overall, and really focused largely, I would say, in America. Randomized controlled trials are very small, short follow-up studies. There's only a couple of really large ones, and most have short follow-up. Food definitions are not clear. Diet isn't measured accurately. Analysis is often limited. I suggest here using a causal diagram approach, as I mentioned earlier, to identify your confounding factors when you're trying to look at associations between particular risk factors, dietary risk factors, and cancer outcomes. And also, I just note here some work by Peter Tennant and colleagues at Leeds who are strongly telling us that we shouldn't use change scores. So although we haven't in our cohort, I did find some cohort studies which have been published that did use change in dietary behavior in relation to outcomes, cancer outcomes, in observational data, because this is subject to what's called the Lord's paradox. I haven't got time to go into it, but just remember, don't use change scores here. There's often high heterogeneity in systematic reviews. Studies are not corrected for measurement error, and residual confounding could occur. What would we do differently now? And I raise this because I'd like you. I mean, I've done this. I'm at the other end of my career. So many of you will be at the start. Try to get something going in your own country. It doesn't need to be that expensive now, because you can use online data collection, making things much cheaper than it used to be. You can use much larger numbers as a result. we would definitely be using new technologies to collect our data, such as the MyFood24 tool. And we could undertake sub-studies to collect better and new biomarker data. Record linkage is a challenge, but it is now possible in the UK with general practice and hospital data from the start. And I think we should also include multi-generational households as well. So just to say thank you to my colleagues who've been involved in the women's cohort study, particularly highlighting the statistical expertise of Dr. Darren Greenwood, but all of these people featured here and many more have been involved in that work. So thank you very much for letting me speak to you just now, and I will end my slideshow and hand back. Stop share.
All right, thank you, Prof. Janet, for a very comprehensive, very informative presentation on diet and cancer and how we can use a lot of data and a lot of sharing what you have done in the UK. And I suppose all of us here, especially the young ones, should try to take up what we should do differently. And I like what you suggested. So thank you very much. Also keeping on time. Now, so we move on to the next session, which is to hear two postgraduate students, one from Malaysia, one from Indonesia, who have come here to share with us their journey doing their PhD. For this purpose, the speakers will have about 3 minutes only, so I do not have time even to tell you you have 30 seconds left. But if I would probably do that if I feel that you are still going too far. But anyway, for the first speaker, may I invite Dr. Nik Nur Izzati. She did her PhD in University Kebangsaan Malaysia. So she has a very nice title, very is good for me actually. Successful ages in Malaysia. What do they eat? Okay, Dr. Nik Nur Izzati, your floor.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Norima, for the kind introduction. So my name is Nik Nur Izzati binti Nik Muhammad Fakhruddin. So I obtained my PhD from University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and today my topic is about dietary pattern of successful ages in Malaysia. What do they eat? Okay. So is my slide moving or not?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Okay. So in 2030, Malaysia was expected to become an aging country with population of elderly is 5.2 million. This is due to large growing population and increase in life expectancy. Adherence to dietary pattern, which were aligned with healthy aging guidelines, was positively associated with successful aging, better quality of life, and improved survival. Okay, so the objective of my study is to identify the dietary pattern for elderly in Malaysia by using factor analysis with principal component analysis extraction method. And the second one is to identify dietary pattern for successful aging as compared to usual aging and mild cognitive impairment among elderly in Malaysia. So the table 1 shows the criteria of aging group involved in this study. Okay, there are three aging group that, as I mentioned just now, and the criteria measured including health status, okay, functional status, and also the mental health status, and not to forget the cognitive status. Okay. So okay, this study is a part of LRGS study, which the subject was 60 years and above. Okay, the subject was selected based on multi-stage random sampling from Kelantan, Selangor, Johor, and Perak, Malaysia. Okay, so the dietary pattern analysis was in phase 2 of the study, and which involved about 579 subjects, and the dietary data was obtained from validated diet history questionnaire for elderly. Okay, so the food intake and then was extracted from the questionnaire and aggregated into 14 food groups. Okay, and then the 14 food groups were then used to analyze using factor analysis with principal component analysis extraction method. Okay, so there are 5 types of dietary pattern identified among elderly and in Malaysia. The first one is sweet food and beverages. The second one is meat, vegetables, rice, and noodles. The third one is local snack, fish and seafood, and high salt food. The fourth dietary pattern is fruits and legumes, and the last one is tropical fruits and oats. Okay, after that, we do ordinary regression, logistic regression to determine the association between these 5 of dietary pattern and successful aging. So we can see that in model 1, a higher score for tropical fruits, oats, was associated with increase of 1.59 times chances of successful aging. Okay, and then in model 2, the association diminished when the model was further adjusted for education level. Okay, and then further analysis indicated that this dietary pattern increased about 2.53 times chance of successful aging among those with secondary education level and above. So as the conclusion, tropical fruits and oats dietary pattern increased the chance of successful aging by 2.53 times as compared to usual aging and mild cognitive impairment among those with secondary education and above. So promoting a healthy dietary pattern such as tropical fruits and oats dietary pattern is a cost-effective strategy to achieve healthy longevity. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nignur Izzati. You really kept within the 3 minutes. Well done. So let us move on with our second postgraduate from Indonesia, Dr. Witri Ardeni. Yeah, Dr. Witri from the University of Indonesia, and she will be sharing with us her work looking at the effect of variation in taste receptor genes on macronutrient intake, studies on TAS1R2. Wow, a handful to read, yeah. So basically on a lot of receptor genes in Indonesian population. Dr. Witri, 3 minit, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Norima. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Witri Ardini, a PhD student at the Faculty of Medicine, Universitas Indonesia. In this session, I will share the result from our research of 2 SNPs, the TAS1R2 as the gene that encodes the sweet taste receptor, and the TAS2R3H that encodes the bitter taste receptor in Indonesian population. A total of 569 people between 20 and 55 years old were included in this study. The majority of subjects are overweight and obese with increased percent body fat. These are the result of genotyping for the 2 genes. The minor allele frequency of TAS1R2 is 17.5%, and the minor allele frequency of TAS2R3H is 35.3%. Here are the overview of subjects' dietary intakes in general. We found that the caloric adequacy in the majority of subjects is higher than their requirement. The proportion of the fat intake is higher, but in the other side, the fiber intake is lower than healthy eating recommendation. This is the comparison of dietary intakes among variants of TAS1R2. There are no differences in macronutrient intakes except for carbohydrate proportions and amount of fat and added sugar. Subjects with CC genotypes have a higher proportion of carbohydrate intake and added sugar than TT and TC genotypes. And here is the comparison of dietary intakes of TAS2R3H. There are no differences in macronutrients intakes except for intake of added sugar. Subjects with CC genotypes have more added sugar per day than GG and GC genotypes. Even though not significant, we find also that fiber intake of CC subjects is lower than other genotypes. On conclusion, we conclude that variation in taste receptor genes could be involved in taste perception and play an essential role in dietary intakes. There are associations between polymorphisms of TAS1R2 and TAS2R3H with macronutrient intakes, mainly carbohydrates. Based on this result, we suggest that as clinicians and nutritionists, we must always to consider patient preferences, and because of that, dietary recommendation must be tailored to individual needs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Witri. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, we have come to the Q&A session. I'm happy to inform that we have received lots of questions, but I think we are quite early. The Q&A is supposed to start later, but if we have more time, probably we can have more questions. So the first question is for Prof. Claire. I think you did answer, you wrote your answer in the Q&A thingy, but it is the person who asked this question would like if you can answer orally. So the question to Prof. Claire is, in pediatric obesity intervention, what would you consider clinically meaningful change in BMI for age? Do you think weight velocity is a good indicator of slowing weight gain?
Yes, I do think it is, because most of the children before they enter the trials are actually on a weight gain trajectory, like an accelerating trajectory. And what I typed into the Q&A was that we actually did a childhood obesity intervention. It was called the Hiccup study. And we followed the children up to 2 years from the very beginning of the study. And we compared doing physical activity plus diet, or just physical activity. But overall, there was a reduction in BMI Z-score of about 0.25, about a quarter, about 0.25 of BMI Z-score. And that was equivalent to a drop in BMI of about 1 unit. And when we modeled how big a change is that, like what does that mean? It meant that they had a growth trajectory, a weight gain trajectory, about half of what the trajectory they were on at the beginning of the study. So it doesn't sound like a lot when you do BMI Z-score, but it actually is changing their diet and weight-related health. And so I think the key take-home message is plot height and weight regularly on the country-specific growth charts for your country, so you can show the parents visually that things are improving.
So thank you, Prof. Claire. So the second question now, this is directed to any panelist. What do you think that a keto diet is better for? Disease prevention, and provides better diet quality? Or should we decrease consumption of fats instead of taking high fat diets? Anyone?
I'm happy to have a go while people are thinking about it, because I did type an answer in on this one too. I wrote 2 articles about the ketogenic diet for the Conversation Australia arm. And I personally don't think you should be using the keto diet unless it's for uncontrolled epilepsy in the context of that. And I'll probably hand over to Janet, because the sorts of foods you eat on one of the FAD ketogenic diets, there's no whole grains on that, very low in fiber, and generally high in the inappropriate fats. And I think Janet's going to add something.
Well, I'm just going to add, yes, I entirely agree. To be honest, I don't really think there's any room for that type of diet. And just pitching back to Claire's talk, where she was saying, you know, that the evidence we have is that people who follow diets that most closely recommend fit the country recommendations are the ones which are most healthy. So I don't think we should be promoting those at all. Yes, we can decrease our fat intakes, but really, to my mind, I've always thought it's energy that's at the bottom of this, whatever the distribution of energy. And there's some question marks over how we assess our energy requirements, to my mind, in something I wrote in the conversation as well. So yeah.
All right. Dr. Umi, when you were doing your study on the Minangkabau ladies, dyslipidemia, from your suggestion, would the recommendation that you give show a good?
Hi, Norima.
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, I see the voice a little bit breaking. Yeah, I think when based also on the diet modeling and dietary approach, when we compare women with dyslipidemia and without, we consistently found a similar finding. They are having a higher fat intake, mostly the saturated fat types, lower fiber. So I think it supports that, yeah, we have to decrease their total fat intake, improve the good fat like pupa, and also increase the fiber. So balanced diet is actually what we should be promoting. And the result from the Minangkabau also shows the same.
Dr. Umi, sorry for the interference of background noise just now.
Can you hear me now, Lily?
Yeah, I can hear, but there's slight interference, but it's quiet now. I think we can move on to the next question now. So this question is again open. So I would say Asian diets, basically, like in Malaysia, in Singapore, or even in Indonesia, maybe Thailand even, diets are usually high in fat and increase the LDL level and increase the likelihood of getting NCDs. And I think many countries in the Southeast Asia has a lot of problem with NCDs. So besides doing exercise and controlling food intake, which people have been doing, and yet the NCDs are still on the rise, what other effective ways to help control this situation?
I'm just wondering, whilst you say people have been controlling their diets, maybe they haven't. What crossed my mind was portion size here. And, you know, you have, as you said, Narima, such tasty food in Malaysia. I mean, you just want to eat big portions of it, and maybe you get served big portions of it as well, because, you know, in days gone by where perhaps people were more physically active, they were needing those portion sizes. And it, you know, as we all know, as we get older, our metabolism changes. I don't need as big a portion size as I used to, and perhaps making those adjustments is actually quite challenging. So I think maybe an emphasis on portion size would be useful. Yeah, very true indeed. I think like in Malaysia, knowledge is there, but it's just the behavior change, wanting to practice even portion control. That would be very good if many can do that. Prof. Claire and Dr. Umi, would you like
yes,
to get on?
The only thing I would add is, like in Australia, like most other countries, it's all the junk foods that are advertised relentlessly, and all the very heavy marketing in everywhere you go. Food and drinks are pushed on you. So one time things were hard to get, now they're super easy to get, and many things, the worst foods for you are quite cheap.
Yep. Dr. Umi?
Yeah, I think I want to support what Janet mentioned. Sometimes people think they are doing diet, but based on our diet modeling, sometimes the frequency, the portions are just not enough. So especially fruit and vegetables intake is challenging in Indonesia. So I think this is something that we need to highlight more clearly in our guidelines to really help them achieve the targeted intake.
Yeah, you know, the good foods, high fiber, whole grains, fruits and veggies. In Malaysia, our National Health Survey has always shown that Malaysians are not meeting the recommendation for fruits and veggies, also for whole grain. A lot of work to be done in this area. Our next question will be, now, what can you say about those working who cannot follow the proper dieting because all they want to do is to buy food which can satisfy their needs without thinking that those foods do not even contain nutrients needed by the body?
I did actually type an answer into the chat for this one as well, just from my own perspective in Australia. So one of the key things that we've done, the group who eat the worst in Australia is actually young adults, have the worst dietary patterns. So we asked them what they thought about nutrition, and they told us, similar to this, they do care about it, but they haven't got any money and they haven't got any time. So I posted the link to the website called No Money, No Time, where they're able to get a brief free dietary assessment, and it links to recipes for things that are easy to make with a very basic minimal kitchen that are cheaper than the junk foods that they normally buy because they think they want them. So I think taking your interventions to meet the needs of your specific populations you're working with is one helpful thing.
So when you talk about young adults, Prof. Claire, would that be below 30, below 35?
Yeah, 18 to 25. But the biggest group who actually use the website are 18 to 35. So, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, during pandemic, people have to eat in most of the time because they don't eat out. But we still do not know the quality of their food preparation, their cooking. I'm sure in Malaysia, people have done some studies to look at whether would dietary intake or cooking be better after the pandemic. Prof. Janet and Dr. Umi, would you like to add on this question? Would you like to respond on this question? Umi, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think I just want to add maybe when opportunity people back to the working from office, the importance of nutrition education at the workplace setting. We started to also promote the FPR in the workplace setting, and it is also encouraged in the WHO Healthy Workplace Framework, and also like controlling the environment, making more healthy foods available nearby this working place, maybe students' place is also important. So food environment is also to pay attention to.
Yeah, totally agree. Maybe we can move on to the next question. Okay, Janet. So evidence from cancer
WCFRF report mostly coming from European Western countries, as these countries would have large cohort, but not in Asia. What is your comment on this limitation? And another question from the same person, is dairy linked to higher risk of breast cancer?
Thanks. Yes, I did type an answer to question 5 in the text area, but nevertheless, I think it's really important that we have this gap in Asian countries in relation to cohort studies, and it gives you all an opportunity, if we can somehow manage to achieve it, to do better than we've done, you know, in our countries with cohorts, etc., so that you can create your own new cohorts in your own countries. It takes time, inevitably, to follow up participants, but you now have the opportunity to use technologies that we didn't when we started. So I really do think that you should be aiming to try and fill that gap. How you achieve it, whilst it is obviously going to be cheaper than it used to be to run a cohort study, it still costs something, and you know, it is so difficult to get that research funding. But maybe we could, you could sort of group together and really go to your funding bodies and highlight you could put it like, it's embarrassing that we don't have these cohorts from our countries. You should fund one, and maybe the politicians would think, yes, it is embarrassing, we need to have this. So I don't know, whatever strategy would work, but I know this is being recorded, but nevertheless, it's what I think. So it's an opportunity, it's a gap, and it's clear it needs to be filled. And is dairy or milk linked to high risk of breast cancer? Well, there have been systematic reviews on the topic, and obviously there's been varied findings, but overall the evidence doesn't show a link between dairy consumption and breast cancer risk.
All right, thanks, Janet. Jamila, next question.
The question 6 is at the bottom, Prof.
Yeah, that's been answered.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I said no, it's not.
No link.
Sorry.
All right. Okay. Deciphering dietary patterns is dependent on, yes, validity of the dietary assessment. So what are the 2 aspects that speakers would like to see improved with regards to dietary assessment globally and with respect to developing countries? Yeah, how can we improve the dietary assessment?
That's a really good question, and I think we've got to be prepared to accept that some of the things we've done to date are limited, and to try and think of new ways, new opportunities, using new approaches, because it's very difficult. If you have spent a lot of time developing a questionnaire that was right 20 years ago, dietary behaviours have changed, and that questionnaire may well not be right, even if it was right then. And a food frequency, I really don't like food frequency questionnaires very much these days. I remember when we were starting our cohort study, I went to see Tim Key in Oxford, and he said that to me, despite the fact that, you know, most studies use food frequency questionnaires. It's so difficult to really get a handle on validity of those tools. So I suggest trying to put aside, kind of use it as a stepping stone to something better. You know, maybe new forms of data from sales or supermarkets, apps, etc., could offer a way forwards, and a relatively easy way for participants as well, study participants. So that's what I'm thinking.
Janet, your NutriTools and MyFood24, so those are online dietary assessment tool, and I'm sure you.
Sorry, yeah, the NutriTools is a kind of library of validated dietary assessment tools, and So you can go on that and have a look at tools. And I've just had a couple of master's students who have, will be updating it soon with some newer tools, because obviously that project finished 3 years ago, wasn't continued funding, etc. So as soon as it stops, it gets out of date, but we are going to update it soon. So that's a library of tools. And then the MyFood24 is a web-based app. Well, there's an app, there's a healthcare version and a research and teaching version. We've got it in different languages. I'm so hoping to be able to create something with colleagues in Malaysia, but so far we've not been able to do that. But we have got offline functionality now. We've got Spanish language, which is going to be used in the Peruvian study, some African databases, as well as European databases. So that's what we're trying to do anyway.
Yeah, that's something that we can explore.
Yeah. Oh yeah, please.
Right.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
So one of the things you might like to have a look at, we have a Bill and Melinda Gates funded project that's just wrapping up, and it's on voice, image and sensor technologies for dietary assessment in low and middle income countries. Most of the work has been done in Cambodia because COVID disrupted the work we were doing in Tanzania, but it's using smartphones, it's using image-based assessment. But the thing we're really proud of is we've actually developed algorithms for shared plate eating. And I think that's probably one of the challenges in countries where food is predominantly shared. So we're just looking at the validity data from what we've collected in Cambodia. So it's called BISIDA, BISIDA. You can have a look at the website, but you have to wait for the papers because we're slowed up because of COVID. If I could have a wish list, I would say, number one, can the world just spend some more money on dietary assessment methods? And two, I think we need more money spent on accelerating biomarkers of dietary intake, and particularly at the point of care, so that they can be used to inform the needs for individuals. And the other thing I think is that the dietary assessment methods should be used in the way we are using some of them, to give the individual who's done all the work of collecting their diet personalized feedback that they can use the information.
Right. Dr. Umi, you know, Malaysia, Indonesia, we're so much alike, and how difficult it is to do the assessment among Asians, I would say. And would you like to share anything, Dr. Umi?
Yeah, maybe to add to what ideally can be added from dietary assessment. First, of course, to ensure the quality by, I think I would encourage people doing dietary assessment to look into currently more available guidelines on doing a pre-survey to standardize like food model, portion size estimate, and also the improvement of the FCT to include the more complete nutrients. I think it's more and more, if we can have more shared FCT with more nutrients related to the disease prevention, that would be great. I know FAO is doing it, but I think we need more and more shared information on that. And in terms of diet modeling, it would be nice if, for example, countries can also generate from their dietary survey some kind of like food pattern, which can be derived. And so we can compare this information, as well as can make use of this for diet modeling to identify more specifically the problem nutrient and also the nutrient. So that would be my wish list as well.
Yes, I think we have a good discussion on this, and a lot of avenue that we can explore even within our Southeast Asian region and the whole world. Okay, Jamila, more questions? Is eating clean occasionally able to improve diet quality? Well, maybe eating clean here means vegan style eating for a certain time. And anyone?
The only thing I would say is that it's what you do most of the time rather than what you do occasionally that has the biggest effect. I have written articles on vegan dietary patterns for the conversation, one for mothers and children, and one for the nutrients to watch out on. the healthiest dietary pattern from the evidence, when the last time I checked, was actually for fish eating vegetarians. But even in the literature, there's a caution because, and you alluded to it, I think you alluded to it, Janet, was that there's unhealthy vegetarian eating patterns as well. So having a diversity of our basic nutrient-dense foods, like a big variety, seems to confer the healthiest pattern.
All right.
Yeah, great.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we move on to the next question. I think we've finished about 10 questions, and then I will wrap up this Q&A. Last question, all right. If written information about nutrition isn't so effective, what else can we use or do specifically during this pandemic to intervene the nutritional status of people of all age group?
I think it's challenging. I think that we need to engage with our policymakers to put nutrition, up the agenda, really. When our Prime Minister got COVID, he realized he was going to need to lose some weight, and he has lost weight. And then we've had sort of, famous footballers championing food in schools. I mean, annoyingly, not annoyingly, it is good, but we as individual, just academics, we can't have that sort of impact. Maybe Claire does, because she's a bit of a media person, but I don't. So I think that we need to use our influencers and our policymakers to get our evidence-based messages across.
Yeah, I agree with you, Janet, about trying to influence policymakers. Like even in our country and what all the evidence shows about diet related to chronic disease risk, it's still very unlikely that in primary care, which is general practice, I know it's got a different term everywhere, but your local doctor is not likely to refer you for an intervention, even though we have 8,000 dietitians in Australia. So, and we know that of the funding scheme that's designed to help people get their personalised dietary advice, only 1% of referrals go to the dietitians who are there waiting to take the referral. So again, I think the problem with nutrition is that some of the key policy makers, they still have a personal belief that it's about personal choice. So I think we have to work through every policy avenue we can to try and ensure people can get what they need. And then I think for our most vulnerable people in all of our countries, we do have to have these food programs informed by the work that Yumi's doing to make sure they get what they need to get the kids off to the best start in life.
Right, correct. Dr. Umi, would you like to add?
Yeah, I fully support the policy to be to be directed towards producing nutrient-dense foods, less energy-dense. But I think I also at the grassroots level would like to suggest that we talk more of the people language, maybe after nutrient to food and even after nutrient to recipe language. We know that many groups are followed by many followers when they're talking recipes, for example, but behind that is nutrition, and also something that will be more a self-reflection, like we did some kind like a self-filled calendar for somebody to monitor her own diet, for example. So this kind of thing I think help, and of course the peer group kind of thing, which we also did in our intervention.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much, our three speakers, Prof. Claire Collins, Dr. Umi Famida, and Prof. Janet Kate. I think we had a very interesting discussion from the Q&A session beyond the topics that you were talking during your presentation. May I remind the participants to fill the feedback form and submit it to the Secretariat, and we have got the QR code here. So with that, thank you again also to Dr. Nick Nur Izzati from University Kebangsaan Malaysia and Dr. Witri Ardini for sharing your PhD work. And with that, I hope I will see some of you, if not all of you, sometime. And I will return back this to Ms. Jamila, our MC. Over to you, Jamila. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Norima, for moderating the session. Indeed, it was very insightful and very informative. And thank you once again to all our speakers and to our postgraduate presenters. Just a gentle reminder, like what Prof. Norima has mentioned just now, please, we would like to hear from you. Take out your phone, scan the QR code, and provide your feedback to us. And we need to know how we can do better in the future. And of course, we also need your information for the e-certificate. And just wait for us. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be contacting you to provide you with the link, the YouTube link to this recording, and also for the e-certificate. So with that, we have come to the end of our session. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you, everyone, the speakers, the organizing committee. We hope everybody has enjoyed the program, and I'm sure we have benefited from the discussion. So with that, enjoy the rest of your day until we see you again in future webinars. Thank you very much.